How you doing? It's Jared. What is a bushing pivot? How does it work, right? It's a BRS replicant. There's a few balisongs that have been coming out on the market recently featuring a bushing pivot system. This is one of them, right? And I'll actually get into the pivot on this. There's some interesting things with the pivots on that. I'll get into that in a later video. This is a Chris Reeve Sebenza 21, right? This runs on a bushing pivot system. It's just like the one on the balisong there. And what this is, you can see the washer came off the other scale there. If I open this thing up, you can see that there's a little piece of metal. There's actually something protruding. It's thicker than the actual blade there. This thing will focus in for me. You can see it sticking up past the blade. So when I take the actual blade off here, you can see that bushing is running on the inside. So that's actually what's making contact with the actual bushing, or the actual pivot pin, right? You see the washer sitting on the other side here. It's a little bit smaller to accommodate the actual lock bar. It's the way that the Sebenza works here. If I actually slide the other actual washer back on there, you can see that it's the exact same size as both of the washers together and the blade. I can line them all up here. You can see that? It's perfectly flat. And so when this actually goes into the knife itself, and I put this thing all back together, I'm going to put this back together a different way, but you hear that sizing matters a lot, and especially with something like this Sebenza, because the Sebenza, they always talk about tolerances. Ooh, tolerances, 1/10,000th of an inch tolerance. Why that's actually important with something like a bushing pivot is because it has to be the exact same size as the blade itself and both of the washers, because you're sandwiching the handle scales, both of the handle scales, onto that bushing pivot. I'll show you that in a second, right? And so it's very important that the bushing is sized perfectly. It has to be the exact same size, because if it's not, you'll have a little bit of blade wobble. So what I'm going to do is just set this knife up just like that, right? Put both of the screws in it, and I'll take the actual pivot, set that off to the side. Here's my blade. Line everything up. Make sure that both of the washers are sitting around the bushing. So now I can slide this into the knife, and the bushing will actually hold those washers in place as I slide it in. Set it down, make sure that it's in the right spot. I'll take my pivot, put it in the back, push my lock bar down so I can work the blade around and actually find it. Come on. Find its little home, right? I can put my pivot screw in there. The benefit of a bushing pivot is very easy tuning, right? Because I don't have to worry about how tight that screw is at all. Because a lot of knives you're probably familiar with, if you tighten the pivot down too tight on something like this here, this is another Chris Reeves knife. But if I tighten the pivot down on this thing too tight, it's going to squeeze these handle scales so tight that it's going to squeeze that blade and actually stop the blade from moving so quickly. With this knife here, because it has that bushing pivot, I can tighten this thing down. Look how tight I'm going to get this thing. I'm going to crank on this thing until I am bending that Allen wrench. Look at that, right? Tight as it'll go. And this knife, still free floating. I can open it up, needs a little bit of lubricant, but still smooth, free floating. And that's the benefit of a bushing pivot. So I can crank that thing down as tight as it'll possibly go, and it's still just perfectly smooth. But it has to be the exact right size, because if it's not, I'll have blade wobble. But this is tight. I mean, there's no movement. That thing feels like a solid piece of steel. But you know, solid one piece of steel. You know, so it feels almost like a fixed blade in that lockup, just tight, tight, tight. And the reason that that's achievable is because it's just perfectly fitted. So it's hard to do, but it's a nice thing, especially when you come into something like a balisong, because you just don't got to worry about it. You throw some Loctite in there, crank it down all the way, and you're good to go. That's it. Y'all have a good one.